if I'm representing tenant and I'm looking at that assignment and subletting paragraph, oftentimes the paragraph allows, or the provisions generally allow for assignment and subletting with the consent of landlord, first of all. I always like to include language such that, and that the consent shall not be unreasonably withheld, meaning that if your business is an office tenant and you decide, hey, this space isn't working, maybe you outgrow it, right?
Right.
Maybe you need a bigger space and this isn't working for you. And you find another office tenant that comes in that's willing to pay the same amount, that does approximately the same thing. Landlord shouldn't be able to say no to that just for the sake of saying no.
Exactly.
Right? So, unreasonable consent is a kind of a tag along provision that I always see. The lease may be assigned with the consent of landlord, which consent shall not be unreasonably withheld.
Right.
Okay. But a lot of times a common misconception is that as a tenant who assigns that lease to a subtenant or to a third party, they believe that they're absolved of all responsibility under the lease. And that isn't exactly the way that goes.
Right.
Oftentimes that original tenant essentially stays on as almost a third party to fill in if the obligations of that new subtenant aren't fulfilled. Meaning that, okay, so I outgrow an office space and I bring in, Joe Schmo third party to come in. They are going to be the subtenant for landlord.
Yep.
And they, for whatever reason, default on that monthly payment obligation.
Right.
Well, I'm going to go back to that original tenant and say, well, your subtenant didn't fulfill their obligations, so tenant, now you're on the hook for it. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times people are like, well, wait a minute, you have a subtenant now. You don't need me. That's done. Well, it's really not done. So, and a lot of times when I draft those, I'm including a consent or an acknowledgement by the tenant that their responsibilities are ongoing if there's a failure by the subtenant.
Well, and unless, and we talked about this before too, unless a landlord literally absolves a tenant of their responsibilities, lets them totally out of the lease, and takes on a new tenant, that original tenant is on the hook.
Yep.
And so that's part of the reason why, subleases, it seems like it's harder to fill subleases for one reason or another. And part of the reason is because the water can get so muddy when you've got multiple tenants. And what happens if the subtenant, does damage to the property, and who's going to be held responsible for those things? Right. And you've got multiple parties as a landlord to try to, collect from and that kind of thing.
A lot of times if I'm representing a landlord and a tenant is requesting that, the only way that I is requesting a release of their obligations. Generally speaking, the only way that I advise that's a smart decision is if the guarantor the guarantor of the subtenant is stronger than the guarantor of the first tenant.